Hello everyone. This is a bit awkward because I cannot see any of you, but it's really great to be part of JavaScript Fwdays today. I know it has been really hard for the organizers with this whole COVID situation, so I really want to give them all the credit for handling the situation in such a professional and thoughtful manner. So, like the title of the conference is JavaScript Fwdays. I know this is a conference for JavaScript developers, but I mean, all of you, whether you like it or not, probably have to write CSS as well. And for me personally, I've loved CSS ever since I first picked up web development. And I mean, of course, I like JavaScript as well. I just love CSS more. But sometimes, even though you love something a lot, over time that feeling might fade. But not so with me and CSS. In fact, I'm feeling even more excited about CSS than ever before, because like every good relationship, I think both parties must evolve and grow, and CSS has really evolved and grown a lot. I like to think that I have also evolved and grown, but that's another conversation for another time. Recently, though, I've been thinking more and more about how to show people who find CSS confusing, frustrating, or just new to it, right? How things are easier now than before. And a light bulb went off in my head last year after the Flexbox inspector was released in Firefox DevTools, because it showed me what the browser was actually doing to my Flex items. And I mean, I've always relied a lot on DevTools, for example, the grid inspector when I'm building layouts with grid, because it showed me what was happening with my grid items, what was happening with the content inside my grid. But the Flexbox inspector really kind of highlighted and brought the point home to the possibilities of what DevTools could be. I mean, if it were up to me, I could talk about CSS for days, but don't worry, they gave me a time limit today, so I picked a few very specific CSS properties to talk about. So let's start off with Flexbox, right? Because I mentioned the Flexbox inspector, and this whole talk's just gonna happen in the browser right now. So I think specifically what I want to highlight today about Flexbox is understanding what flex basis does. Because when we use flex to size items, the three key properties are flex grow, flex shrink, and flex basis. And I think flex basis is particularly important for us to understand before we can really figure out what the browser is doing to the size of our flex items. So Flexbox, I feel, can be confusing for some people because the end size of the box is not entirely determined by you. So, some history about Flexbox, right? It's the first layout model that establishes a parent-child relationship between the element and its direct children. So, if you apply display flex on a box, it establishes a flex formatting context where all the children become flex items of the parent. And the browser will calculate the end size of a flex item based on the different values of flex grow, flex shrink, and flex basis. And this mental model might not be very easy to wrap your head around, especially if you've been doing it for a while and Flexbox is new to you. So I think DevTools can help in this regard. Now, like I said, flex basis is the property that is most misunderstood because it is the starting point from which the browser calculates the size of the item. So I want to emphasize the starting point, because this means that the value that you input as your flex basis may not end up being the final size, especially if your items are allowed to grow or shrink. So here we have an example. So these are two groups of content that have display flex applied to them. So let's highlight one of them to see how it looks in. So this is a typical DevTools, right? So as you can see, this is a display flex, and there are no flex specific. So there's no flex-specific properties on this last item. So that means that it's the initial values that the browser will set. And we can see what these values are if we go to the Computed tab. We can highlight Browser Styles, and you can see the default, which is the initial flex values for this item, is a grow value of 0, a shrink value of 1, and the basis is auto. So this is your initial flex values. So what Flexbox does is that it takes into account the free space that is within the Flex container. So free space is space that is not occupied by any of the text nodes. So if you can notice my cursor, the free space for the first example is this bit here, this empty space here, and this empty space here. So the browser, by default, it's not going to break words. So the minimum size that an element, a box, can shrink to is the length of the longest word. So let's say we shrink this. I'm just going to shrink this some more. So the content inside here, it's a bit small right now, but how about this? Let's zoom. No, wrong zoom. Let's zoom this. Right, so if I shrink the viewport all the way here, this is the point where it's not going to shrink anymore, because all the elements have already hit the length of their longest word. So for this one, it's space. For this, it's like space with a full stop. So this is what is known as the min content size. Now, on the other hand, max content, and I'm going to pull this out. In fact, I'm just going to shrink this back. Max content is the length which can fit all the content onto a single line without breaking. So this is a max content width box. So with these values in mind, I'm going to bring you back to the fact that all these items in the first container have a flex basis of auto, which means that it usually, without any explicit widths or flex basis values, auto resolves to the content size. So that's the basic starting size, which the browser is going to start calculating what your end size is, and the Flexbox inspector can show this. So for this, in this current context, if you highlight a flex item and you click on the layout panel, what you're going to see is the browser is going to tell you what the content size is and what the final size is. If I highlight this one where there is some extra space and clearly it grew, the browser is also going to tell you how much your item grew by. So this is the amount of space that the browser grew the second item. So let's go back to the first one. Because if your box, if your element has a width set on it, then that becomes its starting size. That becomes its flex basis. That becomes what the browser uses to calculate the end size. So when I set a width of 200, the base size becomes 200. Now the interesting thing is that if I've explicitly set a flex basis of, let's say, 300 pixels, that will override your width value of 200. So you can see this if you go back to the layout panel, and you'll see now the base size is actually 300, although the width is 200. And that's how flex basis sort of works. And if you look at the second set of examples, it's also same content, but behaving very differently because of a different flex basis value. So if we go back and if we look at the first set of examples, you'll notice that, and I'm going to highlight this so you can see what the flex values are. The first one has a grow factor of 0. Oh no, it has a grow factor of 1. The second one has a grow factor of 2, and the last one has a grow factor of 0. So now even though the grow factor of the first and the second one is 1 and 2 respectively, if you look at the size, the first box is about 330 pixels, while the second one is about 460 pixels. So the first item is not, like the second item is not twice the size of the first. If you do want an effect like that, you can see this happening in the second set of examples, where the final size for the first item is 345 and the second one is 690. So this is exactly double. And how can we get this kind of an effect with Flexbox is you have to set the flex basis to 0, because by doing so, the browser doesn't take into account any of the content within and just treats the whole thing, all the available space, as available to be distributed. So if you did want a 2-to-1 ratio kind of a sizing, you can do it with Flexbox if you set your flex basis value to 0. So hopefully this has sort of demystified a little bit about flex basis for some of you. So that's the first thing that I wanted to cover. The next thing that I want to cover is part of the CSS grid. Not the whole thing, because that's like a full talk. Specifically, I want to talk about grid template areas. So grid template areas is a particular, I would say, feature of grid that I find very useful. So let's see how this looks like. So if you happen to use Firefox, you would be able to have this overlay property that is quite full-featured. So there are even grid display settings. So by default, all you have is the overlay, which is already very helpful, because without it, you can't really see what your grid is. So turn it on, you can see what your entire grid, whether there is content within it or not. And then we can display line numbers, and we can display area names. So that is specifically what I wanted to talk about, which is area names. And if we look at the syntax, now it's a bit smooshed because the DevTools kind of concatenates everything. But if you put it out in your code editor, you can kind of format it so that it aligns up, especially if you're using a monospace font. And I'm really fond of the syntax because it's structurally similar to what we see rendered on your page, which means your code kind of reflects the visual layout of whatever's on your browser. So this is actually very useful if you're doing full page layouts which have numerous items within it. This example is fairly small in that there are only 3 items, but I can imagine if you're doing something like a full page layout with headers, footers, maybe lots of items in it, you have like maybe 20 items, it kind of gets a bit complicated to kind of code each of the positions of your grid items by line numbers. So if you look at the syntax again, let's go back to the item. So every row is made up of, every code is representative of a single grid row. And each value within the codes represent a column. So you have to have a matched up. So if you have 6 rows and 6 columns, you have to have 6 values within each code line, and you have to have 6 lines. So for example, if I kind of mess it up, the whole thing the browser considers this a syntax error. So that's something to take note of. But the advantage of using grid template areas is that you can change the position of your grid items from the parent grid itself, meaning if you look at each of these 3 boxes, so this is a potato emoji, a bread emoji, and a sunflower emoji, and I have assigned each of them respective areas. Not very creative, I called it potato, bread, and sunflower. But if I want to change the size or the position of these grid items, I don't have to touch any of the item code. I can just change their position and layout from the grid template areas itself. So for example, if I don't want bread to take up 4 grid cells, what I can do is I just change it directly from the grid template areas. And as you can see now, bread takes up 2 cells. So the advantage of this is if you have, for example, need numerous different layouts for different viewports. You don't actually have to go to each of your individual items and adjust their positions for all the different breakpoints. You can have your media queries, but have your media queries change only the grid template areas. So I feel that this actually makes your code easier to maintain and organize in the grand scheme of things. So what's interesting about Grid recently, because Grid came out in 2017, right? Last year, Firefox shipped SubGrid. So SubGrid is an extension of Grid's capabilities, because even though Grid was pretty revolutionary when it came out, there were still some things that it couldn't do at the time. So the initial implementation of Grid only allowed direct children to participate in the Grid. What this meant was that if you had any content inside your Grid item, it wouldn't align to the main grid, because then it became a grandchild and that didn't participate in the grid layout. So allowing nested grids to participate in the sizing of the parent is what SubGrid is all about. And we can see this. I'm going to highlight this other grid. Should be, no, this one. So you can see this is also a grid layout. But what is different from the first one is that the children within it, so as you can see, I have a green and a yellow grid item. But there is content within these grid items as well. So if we look at how it's sized, so there's a lot of there are a lot of lines here, but we can go through them. So because they are also grid items, I've sized and positioned them using the grid row and grid column properties. But to make it a subgrid, what you do is you would also make it a display grid, and then you use subgrid for the grid template columns value. So to define a grid, what you would do is you put a display grid value on an element, and you kind of decide how many rows and how many columns and what their sizes would be using the grid template columns and grid template rows properties respectively. And then you position the item, you kind of assign the size and position of the item using grid row and grid column. So because they're grid items themselves, for example, this one, the green one, I've placed it at grid row number 3. I want it to span 3 rows. I placed it at grid column number 1, and I want it to span 4 columns. So that's its own size and position. But it is also itself a grid. So grid template columns and grid template rows, they are sizing properties. And that's where the subgrid property is applied. You do not do display subgrid. That's not going to work, because subgrid is merely a sizing property that tells the grid to follow its parent's size. So when I put grid template columns subgrid on the green item, and the best part about this is that you can also see the subgrid numbers from DevTools. So what happens is that the columns for the green box, the green item, is sized according to the parent's grid, but the rows are not. So you are free to kind of set the sizing only in one dimension if necessary. So for example, so I've got A, B, C, and D. Because the rows are not sized according to the parent, you can see that they don't line up with the parent grid. For the yellow one, I switched it around. So the columns are subgrid. The rows are the rows are also sized differently. So you can either make your subgrid match your parent grid exactly, or you can only do it in one dimension. So this allows the content within your grid item to be aligned to the larger grid. So I can align item 1 with B, I can align item 2 with C, even though they're in separate grids, but nested within the same grandparent. So the thing about subgrid is that the line numbering kind of differs, and you can see this from DevTools, because there are 7 lines for the parent grid because it's a 6 column. The individual subgrid themselves have their own line numbers. So where the yellow grid where the yellow grid starts, it starts at, even though the parent number is 3, it starts at 1. So if you were to kind of align your child item, you would use the subgrid's line numbers and not the grandparent grid's line numbers. Okay, and moving on, the next bit. This particular property is not exactly new. I just don't see it being used very commonly. Because my background is with web agency, where we do kind of more editorial style layout sometimes, and this is a kind of a design that we see quite often in print, especially for designs that have a lot of images, fashion designs where they lay out the text around the image of a model or the image of something. And your text can flow around it, and for the longest time, we could not do this on the web with like proper text. Usually it'd be text in an image, which is not the best solution, let's be honest. So this is a property called CSS shapes. Hang on. Let me reopen that window. Sorry about that. Full screen. Right. And the property is called shape outside. So how to use it is that, unfortunately, for now, you have to float the element. So this star here it's also not an image, it's a div that I've shaped it into a star using the clip path property. So we're going to talk about both these properties, shape outside and clip path. So the shape outside and clip path properties both can share the same value types, in a sense that they both make use of basic shape values. For example, there's circle, there's ellipse, there's polygon, which is the one that I'm using for this particular example. So what polygon does, polygon essentially lets you set points, right? So these coordinates for points make up the shape of this 5-point star. But sometimes, what's the difference between shape outside and clip path? It's easier to visualize it rather than I trying to describe it. So what shape outside does is, shape outside determines the shape which the text around it flows. So if I adjust it, and if you toggle this kind of a graphy looking icon in the DevTools, it's going to toggle this overlay on your shape, which you can adjust. And as you adjust it, you can see the values of the coordinates of the polygon changing. So this is pretty good, because then you can just copy and paste this into your actual source code. So what the shape outside property does is it affects the text that is around the floated element. So I can kind of change it. I can, change the shape. So as you can see, there is a limit, and I'll talk about it in a bit when I talk about clip path. So what clip path does is that it clips the box. So at the end of the day, everything on the web is still a 4-cornered box. So if I take away clip path, the star, the star is actually this square, right? So the square here, no matter how I change the shape outside, it's not gonna go beyond the square, because that is the dimensions in which this shape can sort of operate. So clip path, what it does is, shape outside affects the content around the clipped element, and clip path itself is what is clipping the element. So if I did want to change the shape of the star, I would change the clip path property. And again, no matter how I adjust the coordinates, I don't have to really worry about the values, because the DevTools updates accordingly. And if you're kind of tweaking your shape and you're happy with this misshapen star, you can just copy this value back to your source code, no problem. So I think I've covered quite a bit of DevTools with isolated examples. So let's kind of see how all of this can be put together in a more well-rounded example. Let's call it that. So I'm gonna open this up. So this is kind of a demo page that I've built. I don't know if anyone has ever played this game on the DS Lite, but I'm very fond of it. So I kind of tried to put together as many of the properties that I talked about as possible. So turn on DevTools. So as you can see, I've used the shape property. So the shape property is not only applicable for basic shapes, you can actually make it flow around an image. So this is an image, but it's a ping. So if I highlight it, it is a ping because I needed the alpha property. So if you use shape outside with an image that has an alpha value, so like the text can kind of flow under the tail of Chibiteresu, which is this main character here. So I can set the image threshold, which is essentially the alpha value. Because depending on how you process your image, I think the value, you can affect how much, it's like a tolerance level when you're doing Photoshop, right? And some other things that can be done that are done on this page is that I think these live chat things are fairly common UI interface on a lot of websites, especially those with customer support. So what you can do is, I'm gonna try to pretend to be hello, how is, no, I can type in here, I'm like, hello, what is the meaning of life? And so as you can see, this left to right interface is fairly common for most, I would say, chat interfaces. And we can do this without a lot of code by using Flexbox. So if I highlight message area, you can see that this entire message area, it's a Flex container. And there is a lot of empty space here. So in order to make this chat window, at this chat input, stick all the way to the bottom, again, because the main container of the page is also a Flex container, what we can do is we can just make the section, give it a Flex grow value of 1, it will just fill up all the space and push it to the bottom. So you don't have to do any weird calc things to have a fixed height for your message area just to get this to be flush at the bottom. So that's pretty cool. And you can also do, so what I've done on purpose here is sort of made it lay out in a kind of a left-right manner. But if you look at the markup, even though they are alternating left and right, so for the, for example, for this agent, the image is on the no, sorry. So the messages are still aligned up in a left to right manner using the box alignment properties. So you don't have to do any odd floats, and you don't have to like do any float clearing things. You can just use flex start and flex end to align your chat messages left and right. And even making the chat messages start from the bottom of the page, that's also fairly straightforward. You don't have to actually use any JavaScript to calculate the height. What you would do for this sort of a layout, this sort of an effect is, let me try to find it. Okay, so what you would do is you would set the first message to have a margin top of auto, because it would just automatically push all the content down to the bottom. So there's a lot of, I would say, layout patterns that have been quite challenging to build in the past, where you'd either need at least a bit of JavaScript or you'd have to write a lot of complex code to do, that has become much easier with a lot of these modern layout techniques. And I personally have a wish list of more things that DevTools can do in order to help us understand all these new CSS properties. For example, there are things like logical properties. There's mixed writing mode. So for example, if you look as I resize this title text, it's laid out vertically with the writing mode property, and so this is kind of like a mixed layout mode layout, which for now is not that easy to debug because there aren't enough enhancements on the DevTools side to kind of indicate how the things are laid out in mixed mode, which is something that I wish would happen. So hopefully this may happen in the future. But there's a lot of things that we can lay out on the web that we couldn't do before. So my wish is for more people to try out these new properties, because you don't have to use all of them. I think just knowing that you can do all these things with CSS, and so when the time comes that you do have to build something like this, you can go and find out how it works. And I hope that DevTools can help all of you figure out all of this stuff, just like it had helped me. Thank you very much.
So the first question is, do you use any additional web extensions for more convenient work with grids?
Not at all. So everything that I showed is default, comes with Firefox DevTools. So my secret wish is that, so the screen is still being projected live, right? So so there's this Chromium bug.
So the first question is, do you use any additional web
that yeah. So this is, other people, other than me, have kind of wanted to petition Chromium to have something similar with Firefox. So I'm going to take this opportunity to ask whoever is watching right now, go and start this issue so that you can have this in Chrome as well. Because I feel that if you try to use Grid in Chrome right now, there is an overlay, but it's not enough, especially if you're doing more complicated layouts. So what you have when you use Chrome is, I think, I don't usually use Chrome, but okay. So you have a kind of a overlay thing, so you can see, because this is a grid. But that's it. So that's, to me, that's not enough for me. I need something like what Firefox does. So the contrast here is, I need something like this. I need it persistent. I need numbers, and I need this sort of stuff. So if, I don't know, take a screenshot. It's 728062. Like, just go start the issue. Maybe the Chrome DevTools team might look at it.
Okay, so the next question is, what about Chrome DevTools?
Yes, does that cover it? Respond.
I do think that at some point the people didn't see this your screen, so maybe you can maybe can you just repeat, like, quickly?
Okay, right now?
Yeah.
Okay, so in Chrome, a lot of the features that I talked about in the talk earlier, like the line numbers and the ability to have multiple grids, it's not present in Chrome yet. So what I have on the screen right now is that Chromium bug. Because Chromium is an open source, so every one of us can go and like look at issues, can raise issues, and we can kind of vote on issues. If you star it, so I am using my cursor to like highlight where you should click to kind of raise the priority for this particular bug. And to be fair, I think the Chromium team has a lot on their plate to look at. And what we can do as developers to signal to them that this is a feature that we want is to kind of just star the bug, and hopefully it'll get picked up.
Yeah. Okay. So the next question is, can I find code of your demos?
Yes. There should be some way for me to share the link after the talk, but all my stuff is on GitHub. And so I'm just showing it on the page right now, but this link I'll share it with the organizers, and they'll probably share it with all of you. So yeah, all the CSS is here. Actually, there's also a it's live online, so there is a link. And I'm just going to, so it's online, I hosted it on Heroku, and I will share this link with the organizers so they can broadcast it out to all of you, or I'll just post it on Twitter. If you do use Twitter, then yeah, you can just go and see. So this is this is everything. It's online.
Yeah, we'll post it online with you in chat or in email digest.
Yeah.
So I do believe that there are all questions for now.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, so thank you a lot. So soon we will go to our next stall with Ivana Kulo.
Nice.
Stay tuned.
All right, bye.